Please be seated. Good morning. This is Refreshment Sunday. Have you ever heard that term? In the season of Lent, the fourth Sunday is called Refreshment Sunday, when we're supposed to get a little bit of a break from the hard stuff, right? The songs are about mercy and amazing grace. The choir's going to sing the Lord of the Dance. And then we get this really hard story about snakes and God sending snakes. And it's hard, and I can feel it. I can feel it in my body. I can feel it in my bones. I'm going to tell you, I'm a little bit nervous speaking to you today, because I'm aware of so many of us who are grieving and lost and feeling broken. And this is a hard word. And it calls us to spiritual depth and to another level of spiritual maturity. And I know we can go there together. But pray for me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Some of you know I grew up on the banks of the Cane River in Louisiana. It's a beautiful place with live oaks, those big cypress trees that have moss dripping from them. Can you picture that? And the river is filled with herons and cranes, and it's beautiful, but there's also alligators, not my favorite. And my worst fear in the midst of all that beauty, snakes in the water snakes. And on hot summer days, my friend Robbie, this was in high school mostly, my friend Robbie would rope me into going fishing with him on that river. And one afternoon, we were about to launch a small rowboat to go fishing, and I saw him walk very quietly and casually into some tall grass on the side of the riverbank, and he bent over to reach for something, and when he stood up, I could see that Robbie D was holding a water moccasin, a writhing, poisonous snake, slightly pinching the side of its head between his finger. And while the snake's body was twisting and curling up under his hand. And Robbie D turned that snake to him so that they could look at each other. Boy to snake, eye to eye. And the thing I was really aware that the thing that I was most afraid of in the world was right in his hand, staring him right in the face. And the few seconds that he held that snake seemed to me to be unbearable. I couldn't speak, I couldn't breathe. And then Robbie just took a step over to the water's edge and released that water moccasin like a puff of air, and the snake swam silently away. Now, I am not in any way advocating snake handling. That is a spiritual practice that I soundly reject. But I think that what Robbie D did that day, it reminds me of a valuable lesson that the Hebrew people learn from God in today's Old Testament story. This is a story, this is important to remember. This is a story that takes place when the people need a dose of their own spiritual maturity. It's not a story that takes place early in the journey in the first years that they have been found their freedom from slavery in Egypt. It's not a story in the early years of wandering through the desert, through the wilderness. When we meet up with the Israelites today, or the Hebrew people today, in this story, they have been stuck in the desert for years. They are tired. They are impatient. They are like that angry mob at the end of a desperate rope, if you can picture that. They're mad enough to lob some pretty bold complaints at both God and at Moses, their leader. And this is what they said. You can follow along in your scriptures. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt, where we were slaves, only to die in the wilderness? We are out here in the desert, and there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food. They're talking about manna. Now, what does God do when he hears this? Does God respond to them by sending better food or more supplies, or by appointing for them a new leader, or by providing them with comforting words? No, not this time. This time, God sends snakes. What the heck? And then God tells Moses to put a bronze replica of one of those snakes up on a pole and to set it up high in a place where the people can look at it. Set the bronze serpent on a pole, God says, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live. Somehow the looking at it, this snake, will give the people a way to survive being snake bit. But looking only at this remedy, the pole, I think it pushes past the issue of the snakes. Why in the world did God send snakes to plague the people in the first place? It's a fair question. And we might be tempted to blame it on the grumblings of the people, to label them as whiners, to chalk them up as an incredibly ungrateful lot, people who deserve to be punished. But let's get real. They've been in the desert for 40 years. They've been in the desert for generations now, with no maps, no canteens, no end in sight. So I think we've got to give the Hebrew people a little bit of a break for their impatience. It is okay to state your needs. It is okay to say, this is not working. Isn't it reasonable that they would complain? So when God sends in the snakes, it's got to be about something more than what they or what we deserve. I want us to consider the possibility that it's about something bigger than that, something below the surface. And I want us to look at what's really being said here. The Hebrew people say, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" But what are they really saying? Perhaps you've said this before. I know I have. What they're really saying is, why are we here? Because we'd really rather be back there. They are clinging to, longing for a return to what it is they knew, even if what it is they knew was not good for them. It was slavery. This is the dark side of nostalgia. Our bishop talks about this all the time. It's what historian Ken Burns calls an intentional oversimplification of the past, in the sense that we sometimes pick and choose our memories and strategically forget the struggles and the heartaches and the complexities of the past. Nostalgia often paints memories that are not based entirely on reality. But the people are standing in a very human tension between stepping forward into the unknown or stepping back into predictability. At least there we knew what we had to eat, they say. In Egypt, we had fish and cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic. And all that we get here is manna, manna, manna. At least there in Egypt, we knew where the water was. But here in the desert, we have no wells. There are no rivers. We have to depend on Moses to pray for a miracle. to bring us water. And what they were really saying is, even though we have what it is we need here, we don't want to have to ask for it. We don't want to have to depend on anyone else for it. We don't want to have to trust in something that we can't see. What they're really saying is, we don't know what's going to happen next. And all of their complaints boil down to this: we are scared. And isn't that the truth? We're scared. But even after 40 years of wandering, searching, the Hebrew people can't actually name their fears. And that's the problem. That's what's at the heart of this story. It's ultimately a story about facing fear, about looking so far down inside of ourselves that we can finally name what it is that we are really afraid of. So let's just ask the question, what are you afraid of? What are we afraid of? Are you afraid of not being in control? When God sends the snakes, God is sending a bare naked, mature kind of truth. And here it is. No matter how much you want it, you are not in control. You weren't back there in Egypt, whatever Egypt was for you, is for you. And you are not in control now. It's not how the world works. There's a great theologian, I highly recommend his work to you. His name is Frederick Buechner. And he said it this way, this is so perfect. He said, "Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Do not be afraid." All the snakes do is to jar people into that reality. Scary, unexpected things do happen, and so do miraculous things. And our world, our landscape will change and will continue to change. And God is asking us to look on that and live. Accept that and be free at last of our fears. What else are we afraid of? This is the part that's hard. Are you afraid to die? Most people are. It's like the number one thing on the Gallup poll that people are afraid of. But when God sends the snakes, God is sending them and us this message, and we can hear it as either harsh and morbid, or we can hear it with tender ears and with loving truth. Someday you will die. All of us will. It's a big part of Lent, starting with Ash Wednesday. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. But even though we know this intellectually, we can sometimes spend our lives trying to run away from it or protect ourselves from it. We're famous for this in our culture. A culture that promotes pain-free, anti-aging, death-defying actions in hundreds of subtle and not so subtle ways. The snakes bring the message that cannot be denied. You cannot escape death. But this makes the life that we share with one another so much more urgent and so much more amazing. And God is saying, by putting that serpent up on the pole, look on that and live. Look on that and be free at last from all your fears. Folks, I think we spend way too much time wringing our hands and arguing about whether these old stories in the Old Testament ever really took place, or if they happened, or why a harsh God would do these mean things to people. Why would God send snakes? Instead, we could be spending so much more time talking about what these stories mean in our everyday lives. This is a story for people who have been through the ringer, people who are tired and weary. This is a story for us when we are afraid. It says to us, stop denying your pain because your pain is real. Whatever trauma you have faced in your life, whatever has snake bit you, whether it is violence or abuse or racism or insecurity or self-loathing or addiction, whatever it is that has snake bit you, it's real. So look at it, examine it, interrogate it, take it to therapy, take it to God, but look at it, because the looking at it, the facing of it, is what will allow you to move through to the other side of it, to the promised land, to healing, to wholeness, to forgiveness, to our capacity for compassion. If we don't face it, we die. Spiritually, metaphorically, sometimes physically. Not facing our capacity for our own vengeance and for our violence and for cruelty or whatever it is that bites us or has bitten us will just breed more of the same. The facing of it is what allows us to be transformed, to really live. Richard Rohr says, scapegoating and exporting our unresolved hurt is the most common story in human history. And if we do not transform our pain, he says, we will almost assuredly transmit it, pass it on, usually to those who are closest to us, and invariably the most vulnerable. We will just keep handing on our pain to the next generation and the next. Lent is a time when we are invited to get really honest with ourselves and with God, not to beat up on ourselves for our shortcomings, but to look below the surface of what we say and do and ask to find, what is it that I am really afraid of? What is it in my life, in our community, in our history, in our world that is broken and in pain? What is the source of it? And whatever it is, name it. Say it out loud. Write it down. And then, like my friend Robbie, take it by the sides of its head and stare it right in the face. And then put it on a pole. God said, put that serpent on the pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look on it and live. So whatever it is for you, look on it and live. Amen.